A slave once wore a crown and ate from golden plates, but only for a single day. Across ancient civilizations, from the streets of Rome to the temples of Babylon, societies performed a bizarre ritual by crowning a peasant king for a day. This was not an act of charity, but a calculated psychological spectacle with a startling purpose. By the end of this exploration, you will understand the hidden mechanisms that allowed empires to control chaos and reinforce power through these temporary monarchs. Why would a community elevate its lowest member only to cast them down? And what shocking fate typically awaited the person at the center of this drama? How does a single day of fake royalty reveal the deepest fears of an entire civilization? What does it say about us that the same impulse to create a temporary king still echoes in our modern celebrations? This temporary monarch was known by many names: the mock king, the Saturnalian king, a living symbol of inverted order. During specific festivals, the rigid walls of society did not simply bend, they shattered entirely. For a brief sanctioned window, masters served their slaves, children commanded their parents, and the most ordinary person could find themselves seated on a makeshift throne. In Rome, this was the riotous celebration of Saturnalia, a week in December dedicated to the god Saturn, who ruled over a mythical golden age of equality. In ancient Babylon, a similar festival called the unfolded with its own version of this strange custom. The individual selected for this role was never a noble or a warrior. He was almost always drawn from the very bottom of the social ladder, a slave, a condemned prisoner, or a person seen as expendable. He would be draped in fine robes that did not belong to him, presented with a scepter he could not keep, and fed a feast meant for a ruler. He could issue whimsical orders, and for that single day, those commands were to be obeyed with laughter and mock reverence. On the surface, it appears as pure chaotic fun, a carnivalesque break from the grind of daily life. But historians see a far more calculated purpose at work. Think of a steam engine building immense pressure without a release valve, it would eventually explode. These festivals of reversal acted as that precise valve. They allowed the pent-up frustrations, the envy, and the simmering tensions of an unequal society to be vented in a controlled, symbolic manner. By letting a slave play king, the system acknowledged the human desire for power, but contained it within a ritual box with a clear expiration date. Everyone could participate in the fantasy that the social order was fluid, all while knowing that tomorrow, the old rules would snap back into place, perhaps feeling even more justified and permanent. The great anthropologist James Frazer, in his seminal work The Golden Bough, analyzed these rituals through a lens that adds a darker, more solemn layer. He interpreted the mock king not just as a clown, but as a sacred scapegoat. In this view, the peasant was not merely elevated, he was loaded symbolically with all the perceived sins, misfortunes, and spiritual impurities of the community. He carried the bad luck for everyone. His day of luxury was not a reward, but a final meal, a dressing up before a profound and solemn sacrifice. This transforms the ritual from a simple party into a deep psychological transaction, where a society believes it can purify itself by transferring its collective anxieties onto a single temporary vessel. So what truly drove this bizarre tradition? It was the ancient world's sophisticated, if unsettling, answer to a timeless human need, the need for catharsis and the relentless pursuit of control. It offered a story where chaos had a king, and that king had a schedule. To understand this fully, we must step into the streets of Rome during the dark days of December. The Saturnalia was not a minor holiday, it was a citywide transformation. For a week, businesses closed, courts were adjourned, and the entire social machine ground to a celebratory halt. The ordinary rules of dignity and rank were suspended. Masters would serve elaborate meals to their slaves, and families would gamble together using nuts as currency. At the heart of this sanctioned chaos was a single figure, the princeps, the Prince of the Saturnalia. He was not a volunteer for this role, but a slave chosen by lot, often through a game of chance like drawing a bean from a cake. In an instant, his reality was upended. He was dressed in colorful, often ridiculous robes that mimicked a king's garb, given a felt crown instead of laurel, and handed a mock scepter. His new subjects, the very people who owned him, would bow with exaggerated politeness and ask for his royal commands. And what were these commands? They were the essence of the festival, absurd, humorous, and deliberately trivial. He might order a senator to sing a silly song, or demand his master carry him around the dining room on his back. The laughter was genuine, but it was laughter within very strict walls. This was the key: the inversion was total, but it was also temporary and completely contained by the calendar. Everyone understood that on a specific day, the festival ended, the robes came off, and the slave returned to his station. So why go through such an elaborate charade? The Romans saw their world as a balance between order or cosmos and chaos or chaos. They believed that to maintain peace and stability, you could not simply suppress disorder, you had to give it a ceremonial outlet. Saturnalia was that outlet. By ritually enacting the world turned upside down, they drained the real revolutionary potential from the idea. It allowed every slave to taste a fantasy of power, and every master to briefly experience humility, all within a safe, time-limited container. When the holiday ended and the social hierarchy snapped back, it felt more natural, more inevitable, because everyone had just participated in a drama proving that the alternative was mere temporary play. Laughter then was a tool of social cohesion. It allowed resentment to be expressed not through rebellion but through jokes, and in doing so it disarmed it. The mock king was the star of this show, a living symbol of a world that could be, but never would be, permanently changed. This ritual was brilliant psychological theater, a way for a powerful empire to manage the tensions within it without bloodshed. Yet, as we will see, not all cultures viewed their temporary monarchs as mere actors in a comedy. In some places, the crown was a far heavier burden, and the final act of the play carried a solemn and ultimately irreversible weight. But the Roman Saturnalia, for all its psychological complexity, was a festival of laughter and return. In the ancient Mesopotamian world, a similar ritual took on a far more solemn and chilling character. Here, the crown was not a felt prop, but a deadly trap. The Babylonian festival, known as the, presented a version of the mock king that was stripped of all comedy. When court astrologers, those meticulous readers of the stars and animal entrails, detected terrifying omens predicting disaster, illness, or even death for the reigning monarch, they did not panic. They enacted a precise and ruthless protocol. A substitute was found, almost always a condemned prisoner or a slave from the fringes of society. This man was not chosen for his humor, but for his expendability. He was brought into the very heart of power, the royal palace. In a ceremony of profound deception, he was dressed in the king's own robes, given the royal scepter to hold, and seated upon the throne. For a single day, he was treated with the full deference owed to a sovereign. He ate from the king's table, slept in the king's bed, and his every whimsical command was obeyed as law. To the unseen forces of misfortune, the message was clear: here sits the king of Babylon. This was the ultimate decoy operation. The belief was that the evil fate stalking the land, whether a curse, a plague, or a military defeat, would be fooled by this elaborate ruse. It would see the splendid figure on the throne and expend its destructive energy upon him, instead of the true ruler hiding in plain clothes somewhere in the shadows of the palace. The Greek historian, a priest of Bel who wrote extensively on Babylonian history, documented this practice. He described how the substitute's brief, glorious reign had a fixed and terrible conclusion. When the appointed hours had passed, the ritual reached its inevitable end. The robes and insignia were removed. The decoy king was then led away and executed, often by methods described as crucifixion or scourging. In that final act, he did not just stop playing a role, he fulfilled it completely. He became the vessel that carried away the kingdom's impending doom, a human sacrifice offered to preserve the stability of the state. This transforms the idea of the king for a day from a social pressure valve into a matter of spiritual survival. It reveals a worldview where sovereignty was not just a political office, but a spiritually dangerous position, a lightning rod for cosmic misfortune. The real king's safety, and by extension the safety of the entire kingdom, depended on having a buffer, a willing or unwilling stand-in who could absorb that fatal strike. Where the Roman ritual used laughter to disarm social tension, the Babylonian ritual used solemn ceremony to redirect perceived cosmic danger. One was a psychological tool for managing people, the other was a theological tool for managing fate. Both, however, shared a core, unsettling logic that the health of the many could be purchased with the designated suffering of the one. This notion of the sacred scapegoat, the one who carries the burden for all, did not vanish with the fall of Babylon. It would echo through history, finding expression in stories, symbols, and even in the quiet, unrecognized corners of our own modern world. Centuries later and a world away from Babylon, the same powerful impulse for ritual reversal found a home within the very walls of the medieval church. Here, the strict, divinely ordained hierarchy of clergy and laity was momentarily upended in spectacularly public fashion. Across the cathedrals of France and England, during the 12 days of Christmas, a peculiar and raucous tradition took hold, known as the Feast of Fools. In a parallel custom, young choirboys would elect one of their own as the boy bishop. This child, dressed in miniature episcopal vestments, would lead processions through the streets, deliver humorous sermons that often poked fun at his elders, and even bestow blessings upon the amused congregation. For a day, the solemn authority of the bishop was embodied in a boy, and the dignified deacons might find themselves replaced by a lord of misrule who presided over a service filled with chaotic singing, dancing in the aisles, and the burning of old shoes for incense. This was not an act of rebellion from outside the church, but a sanctioned release valve built into its own calendar. The historian E.K. Chambers studied these festivals extensively, noting they served as a crucial outlet for irreverence within an otherwise rigid and solemn institution. The laughter was loud, the parody was sharp, but it was all contained within the specific days marking the birth of Christ. By allowing the lower clergy and even children to symbolically mock and mimic their superiors, the church provided a way to dissipate the natural tensions of a highly structured community. Everyone could participate in the fantasy that the order of things was flexible, all while knowing that when the feast day ended, the real bishop would resume his seat and the traditional liturgy would return, perhaps feeling even more respected for having survived the mockery. This ecclesiastical inversion mirrors the logic of the Roman Saturnalia perfectly, but with a theological twist. It acknowledged that spiritual life, like social life, could not be all solemnity and stricture. It needed moments of sanctioned, symbolic chaos to reaffirm the normal order. The temporary king had simply traded a royal scepter for a bishop's crozier, proving that the need to ceremonially turn the world upside down is a thread woven deeply into the fabric of human society itself. Yet as we trace this thread further, we find it does not simply end with history. It subtly weaves itself into the celebrations we know today. The power of these rituals lies not in the crown, but in the collective sigh of relief when it is taken away. At their core, these festivals of reversal were masterful exercises in social psychology, long before the term was ever coined. They operated on a principle that feels almost modern, the concept of catharsis. By granting a temporary, symbolic overthrow of authority, these societies provided a safe outlet for the simmering frustrations, the envy, and the latent aggression that inevitably build up in any rigid hierarchy. Think of it as a controlled burn in a forest. By deliberately setting a small, contained fire, you prevent a catastrophic, uncontrollable wildfire from erupting later. The day of the mock king was that small, contained fire. It allowed the common person to scream with laughter instead of rage, to command as a joke rather than a demand. All the tension that could fuel real rebellion was spent in a spectacular and ultimately meaningless performance. This idea finds a perfect description in the work of the 20th century philosopher. He studied medieval carnivals and developed the concept of the carnivalesque, a temporary world where all norms are inverted, where the fool becomes wise and the king becomes a beggar. But crucial insight was that the carnival does not truly threaten the established order. In fact, it strengthens it. By allowing people to live in an upside-down world for a day, they return to the right side-up world with a renewed acceptance. The peasant on the throne was not a vision of liberation. He was a living cautionary tale, a metaphor for the chaos and absurdity that would ensue if the social ladder was truly kicked over. His ridiculous commands and awkward bearing showed the masses that real power in their eyes required breeding and training. It was not for everyone. The festival made the normal structure, with its familiar injustices, seem not only normal but necessary and even natural. This is why these rituals were such brilliant instruments of control. They offered the masses a breathtaking simulation of power, a taste so brief it only made the hunger disappear. It was the ultimate pressure valve. Slave who had been mockingly obeyed for a day was far less likely to challenge his master on day 365. A peasant who had worn a paper crown and heard the crowd cheer might carry that memory as a substitute for actual political agency. The system, by sponsoring its own parody, inoculated itself against genuine revolution. It acknowledged the human desire for recognition and agency, but funneled that desire into a ceremonial dead end with a very clear exit sign. When we understand this psychological mechanism, the entire spectacle shifts from appearing as an act of generosity to revealing itself as a profound tool for stability. The laughter in the streets was not a challenge to the palace. It was the sound of the palace ensuring its own survival. And if we listen closely, we can still hear echoes of that same calculated release in the way we celebrate today, in the way we crown kings and queens of homecoming or festival parades, enjoying a harmless inversion before returning to our everyday roles. The very objects that defined a king held a dangerous magic of their own. A crown was never just a piece of metal, and a scepter was far more than a decorated rod. In the hands of a true monarch, these items were believed to be infused with the sacred authority of the office itself, a tangible link to divine right and ancestral power. This is what made their use in the mock king rituals so charged and deliberate. When the community placed a crown of leaves or felt upon the head of a slave, they were not simply dressing him up. They were performing a profound act of symbolic transference. The sacred potency of kingship was temporarily, and very carefully, siphoned into a vessel everyone knew was meant to be broken. The peasant became a living sculpture of authority, an abstract representation that the entire community could safely interact with. They could bow to it, laugh at it, even obey it, precisely because they all understood the man inside the costume held none of the crown's true, terrifying power. This ritual handling of the symbols allowed people to touch the idea of absolute rule without being burned by its reality. It made the monumental concept of kingship momentarily approachable, even ridiculous, thereby draining it of some of its innate terror. The conclusion of the ritual was just as symbolic as its beginning. The removal of the robes, the taking back of the scepter, was a visual and physical restoration of order. In many traditions, the costume items themselves were not simply stored away for next year. They were often destroyed, burned, or cast into a river. This act was crucial. It signaled that the dangerous, inverted state of the world was conclusively over. But it also hints at a deeper, more superstitious belief that the objects themselves had become contaminated by their contact with the profane. They had held the symbolic weight of chaos and needed to be purified or disposed of, lest their inverted energy linger. This manipulation of symbols was a powerful, wordless language spoken to every member of society, from the illiterate farmer to the educated scribe. It communicated a complex message. Yes, you can touch the dream of power, but only as part of a story we control. The crown you see is real, but the authority it represents is on loan, and the loan has now come due. This silent theater of objects taught a lesson more effectively than any decree, reinforcing that true power was not in the glittering symbol, but in the unshakable system that decided who could wear it and for exactly how long. The ritual's power did not flow from the throne, but from the faces in the crowd. For the inversion to work, everyone had to play their part. The laughter that filled the streets, the exaggerated bows, the feasts where masters served slaves, none of this was spontaneous entertainment. It was a required performance, a script that every member of the community, from the highest noble to the lowest laborer, was expected to follow. This mandatory merriment was the engine of the entire spectacle. When a peasant king issued a foolish command and the crowd roared with laughter while obeying, they were not just humoring him. They were collectively casting a vote for the temporary nature of his reign. Their participation validated the ritual's core message. Yes, we can turn the world upside down, but only because we all agree to turn it right side up again tomorrow. This created a powerful, unspoken complicity. By joining in the game, every person became an accomplice in the restoration of the very order they were momentarily mocking. Think of it like a school play where the entire town takes the stage. The shared experience of putting on the costumes and reciting the lines forges a unique bond, a collective memory of a time when rules were different. For a brief moment, social divisions softened within the container of the festival. A lord and his servant, both laughing at the same absurd command from the mock king, shared a common humanity within the confines of the ritual. They were co-conspirators in a harmless rebellion, and that shared conspiracy actually strengthened the social fabric by providing a safe, communal outlet for tension. The crowd was never just an audience, they were the most essential actors. Their cheers and their obedience breathed life into the temporary monarch, and their eventual silence when the festival ended was what gently laid the character to rest. This dynamic blurred the line between ritual and reality so completely that the return to normalcy felt less like an imposition from above and more like a natural, collective decision. We all had our fun, and now we all returned to work. This mass performance ensured that no one walked away feeling like a passive victim of the social order, but rather as a willing participant in a system that knew how to manage its own stresses. Yet while the crowd played their part with laughter, one individual stood at the silent center of this roaring theater, bearing a weight they never asked for. Yet for the person at the very center of this roaring theater, the experience was anything but a game. We have seen the crowd's laughter and the society's clever psychology, but what of the peasant king himself? What did he think, feel, and truly understand as the robes were placed upon his shoulders? Historical whispers offer us fragments, suggesting a terrifying spectrum of awareness. In the grim context of rituals like the Babylonian, the chosen man likely knew his fate with dreadful clarity. His day of feasting and false reverence was not a gift, but a grim countdown, each hour of luxury ticking toward a final, irreversible act. The wine would have tasted bitter, the laughter of the court hollow, as he played his part in a ceremony designed to end him. Here, the crown was a death sentence worn in plain sight. In the more raucous, non-lethal festivals like Saturnalia, the experience could be wildly different, yet still fraught with a profound ambiguity. A slave suddenly handed absolute license to command his masters might have felt a dizzying, terrifying exhilaration. For one day, he could order an extra portion of food, demand a song from a stern senator, or play a mischievous prank without fear of the whip. This was a taste of a freedom so absolute it was intoxicating. But was it ever truly freedom? His agency was a mirage, bounded by the unspoken script. He could command a playful humiliation, but he could not command his freedom. He could ask for more wine, but he could not ask for the keys to the gate. Any command that genuinely threatened the social order or extended his reign beyond the setting sun would have been met not with laughter, but with immediate and severe punishment. His will was an ornament, part of the costume. This forces us to a difficult human question. In these grand social dramas, what became of the individual soul beneath the crown? He was less a person and more a living metaphor, a vessel for chaos, a receptacle for sin, or a symbol of catharsis. His personal story, his fears, his hopes were irrelevant to the ritual's function. He was a necessary component in a societal machine, valued for his symbolic utility, not his humanity. His journey, whether ending in a return to servitude or a far more solemn conclusion, served one ultimate purpose: to solidify the ritual's message for everyone else. His experience, in its terror or its fleeting joy, was the price paid for the community's collective sigh of relief. By walking this path, he reminded every onlooker of the cost of true disorder and the comforting, predictable weight of the normal world. System stability was purchased with his designated experience, making him the ultimate, and often forgotten, pillar of the entire spectacle. The final act of the spectacle is where its true purpose is revealed. After the laughter fades and the last feast is cleared away, the community must decide what to do with their temporary monarch. This moment of conclusion was never an afterthought. It was the ritual's entire point, the necessary step that transformed playful chaos back into enduring order. The fate of the peasant king varied dramatically, and in that variation, we can read the deepest fears and hopes of the society that created him. In the most solemn traditions, like those of ancient Mesopotamia, the conclusion was stark and irreversible. The substitute king, having absorbed the ill fortune meant for the true ruler, was led away. Historical accounts describe this not as an act of anger, but as a solemn, ceremonial conclusion to a sacred duty. His passing served as the ultimate catharsis, a belief that the spiritual or political threats looming over the kingdom had been literally carried away with him. This was a ritual of profound, if chilling, communal protection, where the well-being of the many was secured through a designated act. In stark contrast, the conclusion of the Roman Saturnalia was one of simple, anticlimactic return. As the festival's final day ended, the slave who had been the prince of misrule would remove his felt crown and colorful robes. He would hand back his mock scepter, and without ceremony, he would resume his place in the household. The inversion was neatly, quietly reversed. There was no punishment for his day of command because his commands were never seen as real. The system demonstrated its supreme confidence by showing that a day of symbolic rebellion changed nothing at all. The social machinery could absorb the chaos and click seamlessly back into its familiar rhythm. Other cultures chose a middle path, one of symbolic expulsion. In some European folk traditions, the figure representing the old year or winter or accumulated misfortune was chased out of the village. He might be pelted with harmless objects or subjected to a playful ritual beating. This was not an act of cruelty, but a dramatic performance of cleansing. By driving the mock king out, the community was physically acting out the expulsion of hardship, illness, or bad luck, visually casting out the things they feared into the wilderness beyond their borders. So why such a wide range of endings? The method of conclusion was a direct signal of the community's perceived needs. A society fearing literal divine wrath required a literal, solemn sacrifice to appease it. A society managing internal social tension needed only a psychological release, a safe return to normalcy. And a community marking the turn of the seasons needed a symbolic act of renewal, of throwing out the old to make way for the new. In every case, however, the final act served the same ultimate function. It was the ceremonial defeat of temporary chaos. Whether through a solemn ceremony, a quiet demotion, or a boisterous chase, the established hierarchy was publicly, visually reinstated. The world was set right again, and everyone could breathe a sigh of relief, having participated in a story where disorder had a beginning, a middle, and a very definitive end. This variety proves the ritual's incredible adaptability, a powerful social tool that could be calibrated to address everything from cosmic terror to the simple human need for a much-needed laugh. The rhythm of the earth itself dictated the timing of these strange ceremonies. Look closely, and you will find that the crowning and uncrowning of the peasant king was almost never a random event. It was meticulously synchronized with the turning of the seasons. The Roman Saturnalia, for instance, was not placed in cheerful summer, but in the deep, dark heart of December, clustered around the winter solstice. This was the time of year when daylight was at its weakest, when the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if the sun would truly regain its strength and the frozen ground would ever bear fruit again. In this context, the Festival of Reversal was about far more than social pressure. It was a collective act of sympathetic magic, a desperate performance to coax life back into a sleeping world. The temporary king, in all his chaotic glory, became a living symbol of the old year itself, a representation of everything that was worn out, depleted, and ready to pass away. His day of license was the final, riotous flare of the dying light, and his subsequent removal, whether through a quiet return to servitude or a more symbolic expulsion, was the community's way of ritually clearing the slate. They were acting out, in human form, the necessary death of winter to make way for the birth of spring. This transforms the ritual from a social tool into an existential one. For agricultural societies living at the mercy of the harvest, the deepest fear was not political upheaval, but scarcity, the silent, creeping terror of a failed crop and a hungry winter. The mock king ritual became a way to manage that profound, elemental anxiety. By creating a controllable narrative where decay and disorder were celebrated and then definitively cast out, people felt they could influence the uncontrollable forces of nature. The peasant who played the role was, for a day, the spirit of the barren field, the shortening day, the stored grain that was running low. His fate was tied to the fate of the land. If he was sacrificed in ceremony, it was with the hope that his symbolic passing would satisfy whatever cosmic balance demanded a price, ensuring the soil's fertility. If he was simply chased out of the village with laughter and noise, it was a performance of banishing the chill of winter to make room for growth. This connection to the earth reveals the ultimate foundation of these rituals. They were ancient attempts to bargain with reality, to impose a story of order and renewal upon a world that often felt random and cruel. The crown placed on a peasant's head was, in the end, woven from the same stalks of wheat the community prayed would grow tall. His brief, inverted reign was a desperate and brilliant piece of theater, staged under the vast, watchful sky, with the entire community praying for a happy ending they could all survive. This pattern of the sacred substitute was not confined to the ancient world of Europe and the Near East. It echoes across the Atlantic, in the vibrant and complex civilizations of, revealing a shared human script written in startlingly similar terms. Consider the Aztec festival of, a ceremony held during the perilous 5th month of their calendar, a time associated with drought and the threat of famine. At its center was not a peasant or a slave, but a carefully selected captive of war. This young man was chosen for his physical perfection, a living canvas upon which the community would project the image of a god. For 1 full year, he ceased to be a prisoner. He was transformed into the mortal embodiment of the smoking mirror, a powerful and capricious deity of destiny and night. His life became a continuous, luxurious performance. He was dressed in magnificent finery, adorned with flowers, and taught to play beautiful music on flutes. He was given attendants and concubines, and wherever he walked through the city, people would kneel and worship him as the god himself. In his final month, the ritual reached an intense crescendo of symbolism. He was ceremonially married to 4 young women who represented goddesses. Together, they lived in a state of divine bliss, a final enactment of sacred union. The elevation was total, prolonged, and steeped in reverence. Then came the festival's climax. Adorned in his full regalia, he was led up the steep steps of the temple pyramid. As the crowds watched, he ascended voluntarily. Upon reaching the summit, he took the flutes he had mastered and one by one shattered them against the stone steps. This act was his final, willing signal. The music of his divine life was over. What followed was a ritual act central to Aztec cosmology, understood not as an act of cruelty, but as the highest form of reciprocity with the forces that sustain the world. The god impersonator's journey ensured the sun would continue to rise, the rains would return, and the cosmic order would be renewed for another cycle. Here, the structure is hauntingly familiar, a prolonged period of extraordinary elevation, a life of luxury and honor, all leading to a predetermined and solemn conclusion for a greater communal purpose. While the cultural meanings differed vastly from a Roman slave's day of comedy or a Babylonian prisoner's deadly deception, the underlying architecture of the ritual is parallel. A society identifies a profound need, whether for social catharsis or cosmic renewal. It selects a substitute, an individual who becomes a vessel for collective fears or hopes. That vessel is loaded with symbolic value through treatment and ceremony, and then, in a controlled ceremonial manner, the vessel is emptied, completing the transaction. From the felt crown of Saturnalia to the divine mantle of human societies kept inventing the same profound story, a story where one person's journey could, in the minds of the community, secure the stability of the many. This global pattern points to something deep within our shared history, a recurring inclination to manage the unmanageable, to bargain with fate itself, by creating a stand-in. By the time of the Middle Ages, the ancient impulse for ritual inversion had not faded, it had simply found a more domestic form. Across the banquet halls of medieval and Renaissance Europe, a charming tradition took root, one that preserved the core mechanics of the mock king while draining away all its mortal peril. This was the reign of the King of the Bean. The setting was often the Feast of Epiphany, or Twelfth Night, marking the end of the Christmas season. In preparation for the grand meal, the household cook would perform a small, secret act, baking a single dried bean, and later sometimes a small silver coin or a tiny porcelain figure, into a large, rich cake. As the cake was sliced and distributed among the guests, from the lord and lady of the manor to their children, and even their servants, a palpable suspense filled the room. Each person examined their slice with care, for the discovery of the hidden token carried immediate and delightful consequences. Whoever found the bean in their portion was, by ancient and unbreakable custom, proclaimed the king, or sometimes the queen, of the feast for that entire evening. A paper crown was swiftly produced, a makeshift scepter might be handed over, and the lucky individual was elevated to a throne of cushions at the head of the table. Their new royal duty was simple: to preside over the merriment. They could issue light-hearted decrees, perhaps commanding the most dignified guest to sing a ballad, or ordering that the next round of drinks be served in a silly manner. The room would erupt in laughter and obey, the temporary inversion of authority providing the evening's central entertainment. Here, the selection was utterly democratic, governed purely by the blind luck of the slice. A scullery maid could find herself giving orders to a duke, or a young child could rule over their parents. This element of chance was profoundly significant. It reinforced a medieval worldview that saw fortune, or as a powerful, whimsical force that could raise up the lowly and humble the mighty in the blink of an eye. The King of the Bean was a living, playful reminder that earthly status was fleeting, subject to the turn of fortune's wheel. While this monarch faced no darker fate than a mild headache the next morning, the ritual retained its ancient symbolic function. It created a safe, festive space where normal hierarchies were suspended, not through fear or solemn ceremony, but through shared joy and the simple magic of a hidden bean. This evolution shows the tradition's incredible adaptability. The community's need for catharsis and symbolic release remained, but the method softened into pure celebration. The sacrificial scapegoat had been replaced by a lucky winner, and the collective sigh of relief was now a collective burst of laughter. The crown was no longer a vessel for cosmic dread, but a party favor, yet it still taught the same subtle lesson, that authority could be a game, and that every game, no matter how fun, must eventually end. But what deep human need gave birth to such a strange and enduring tradition? To answer that, we must step into the world of scholars who have spent lifetimes piecing together the fractured logic of our ancestors. One towering figure in this quest was Sir James Frazer, whose monumental work, The Golden Bough, wove together myths and rituals from across the globe. Frazer proposed a theory that begins not with a peasant, but with the most sacred figure of all, the king himself. In the earliest human societies, Frazer suggested, the king was not just a political ruler, he was a living battery for the entire world. His personal health, strength, and vitality were believed to be directly linked to the health of the land, the fertility of the crops, and the success of the hunt. If the king grew old, fell ill, or showed any sign of weakness, the entire community believed they faced a direct threat: famine, drought, and disaster. The logical, if brutal, solution was regicide, the ritual killing of the weakened king to replace him with a younger, more vigorous successor, thereby renewing the life force of the tribe. Over immense stretches of time, Frazer argued, this stark practice softened. Instead of killing the actual king, societies developed symbolic substitutes. They would kill a slave, an animal, or even a divine effigy to achieve the same renewal. The peasant crowned for a day, in this view, is the final, faint echo of that ancient, terrifying logic. He is the stand-in for the sacred king, the vessel whose symbolic treatment, whether through mockery or a more solemn conclusion, refreshes the vitality of the community without harming the real ruler. It is a story of evolution, from literal sacrifice to symbolic theater. Yet another powerful lens comes from the thinker, who looked at these rituals not through the frame of agriculture, but through the dark glass of human conflict. Scapegoat Mechanism proposes that when tensions, rivalries, and mimetic desires within a community reach a boiling point, the group risks tearing itself apart. To avoid this self-destruction, he argues, societies unconsciously find a resolution by uniting against a single, arbitrarily chosen victim. This victim, the scapegoat, becomes the target for all the pent-up aggression and blame. Their removal, whether through exile or a more final act, provides a cathartic release and miraculously restores peace and unity. The peasant king fits this pattern perfectly. He is chosen from the margins, elevated not for his merit but as a target for both celebration and, ultimately, for the expulsion of the community's anxieties. His reign is a process of loading him with symbolic weight, and his removal is the act of cleansing. When we combine these two theories, the full, profound picture comes into focus. The mock king is a fusion of two ancient archetypes. He is Frazer's substitute sacred king, a figure whose treatment is meant to manage the relationship between the community and the forces of nature or fate. And he is scapegoat, the single figure upon whom a society projects its internal strife in order to purge it. This dual role explains why the ritual could be both a joyous carnival and a solemn ceremony, why the crown could be both a gift and a trap. These theories pull back the curtain on the pageantry to reveal the high stakes our ancestors believed were in play. They were not merely putting on a play, they were performing surgery on the soul of their community, using a designated individual as both medicine and instrument. The laughter in the streets and the silence that followed were part of a deep, old grammar for speaking to gods, managing chaos, and holding a fragile world together. This laughter in the hall, however, carried a sharper edge than simple merriment. Beyond their roles as pressure valves or sacred stand-ins, these festivals of reversal performed a daring and vital function. They were ancient society's premier stage for political satire. By placing a fool, a slave, or a simpleton on a makeshift throne, the entire community could engage in a form of indirect sanctioned criticism. Every exaggerated command issued by the mock king, every absurd decree, every clumsy attempt at royal bearing, held up a distorted mirror to the very real follies, extravagances, and potential injustices of the sitting monarch. Think of it as a yearly review, conducted not with scrolls and reports, but with costumes and comedy. If the real king was known for his love of lavish banquets while the people faced hardship, the mock king might demand a 10th course of imaginary pheasant. If the court was seen as pompous and out of touch, the peasant monarch could order the most dignified noble to speak only in nursery rhymes for the afternoon. The brilliance of this system was its deniability. Because the critique was embedded within a religious festival or a traditional celebration, it was not an act of treason, it was an act of piety or custom. The laughter that roared through the crowd was, on one level, directed at the bumbling actor before them, but on another, deeper level, it could be laughter at the inherent absurdities of absolute power itself. It asked a dangerous question in a safe way. What if the man on the real throne is just as much a performer in a costume as this one? This created a rare and precious space for critical reflection within otherwise rigid, authoritarian systems. For a few hours, the populace could collectively acknowledge the emperor might have no clothes, all while technically celebrating the office that dressed him. This satirical layer transformed the ritual from a purely psychological or spiritual exercise into a tool of intellectual and social commentary. It allowed grievances to be aired, hypocrisies to be highlighted, and the mystique of royalty to be gently punctured, all without a single sword being drawn. The temporary king was, in this light, not just a scapegoat or a safety valve, but society's court jester on the grandest possible scale, speaking uncomfortable truths under the protective guise of festival madness. Yet the throne in this ancient theater was almost exclusively a stage for one gender. While history echoes with tales of peasant kings and substitute monarchs, the role of a queen for a day in these same sacrificial or cathartic rituals is strikingly absent from the record. We find fleeting glimpses in other traditions, of course. The figure of the May Queen, crowned with blossoms in springtime festivals across Europe, symbolizes fertility and the renewal of the earth. Her reign is one of beauty and natural abundance, not of political inversion or solemn duty. Similarly, in the boisterous carnivals of the medieval and early modern period, women might momentarily take on roles of mock authority, presiding over dances or playful courts. But these instances lacked the core, gravity-filled mechanics of the rituals we have explored. There was no sense of a female stand-in, absorbing a kingdom's doom, or serving as a scapegoat for communal sin. Her symbolism was life-giving, not life-taking, tied to cycles of birth and growth rather than the deflection of death or disorder. This stark division is profoundly revealing. In the ancient societies that perfected the mock king ceremony, sovereignty itself was a male construct. The king was not just a political leader, he was a warrior chief, a father to his people, and often a priestly intermediary to male gods. His power was intrinsically linked to masculine ideals of strength, authority, and divine right. Therefore, a substitute designed to fool fate or absorb corruption had to mirror that essential masculinity to be seen as effective. A female decoy would have been a meaningless substitution in the symbolic logic of the ritual, like trying to use a key of the wrong shape. This highlights how these ceremonies were not generic safety valves, but precision instruments calibrated to the specific cultural blueprint of power. The absence of a widespread peasant queen tradition underscores a hard truth. In most ancient civilizations, women were not seen as viable vessels for the transfer of political or cosmic misfortune. Their symbolic roles were powerful, but channeled into different streams, primarily those of fertility, hearth, and lineage. The mock king ritual, in its solemn or satirical forms, was ultimately a conversation about the nature of the throne itself, a throne that, in the imaginations of those cultures, only a man could sit upon, even if his reign lasted just a single perilous day. The echoes of those ancient festivals did not fade into silence with the fall of empires. They simply changed their costume, trading sacred robes for party hats and migrating from temple steps to city streets. The deep-seated human need to ceremonially flip the social script never disappeared, it merely evolved into forms we recognize as pure celebration. Look at the explosive energy of Carnival in New Orleans or, here, the selection of a carnival king and queen is a central spectacle. These monarchs are chosen through elaborate competitions of costume, dance, and spirit, crowned not to absorb misfortune, but to embody the joyous excess of the season. For a few days, they reign over a city where normal rules of decorum are delightfully suspended. It is a world of masks, where identities blur and everyone participates in a collective, temporary liberation. This is the ancient Saturnalian release, now powered by jazz bands and samba schools, where the pressure valve is open not for survival, but for the sheer, vibrant thrill of it. In some British Christmas pantomimes, a character called the Lord of Misrule might still make a boisterous appearance, leading the audience in chaotic songs and encouraging children to shout at the stage. It is a gentle, theatrical ghost of the medieval Feast of Fools, where the authority of the story itself is playfully undermined for laughter. Even closer to home, consider the modern office holiday party gag of naming a boss for a day. An employee might win a silly crown and the nominal right to issue a few harmless, humorous decrees, like declaring an extra coffee break or that meetings must be conducted in rhyme. The dynamic is unmistakable. It is a miniature corporate-safe inversion. The subordinate gets to symbolically command, the manager plays along with gracious humor, and the entire office shares a laugh that acknowledges the hierarchy even while momentarily pretending it does not exist. This evolution from solemn ritual to office party game is a profound journey. The outer form, the crowning of a temporary authority figure, has persisted across, but the inner meaning has been completely hollowed out and refilled with something new. The elements of mortal danger, cosmic dread, and sacrificial duty have vanished. What remains is the pure social and psychological core, the fun of licensed mischief, and the bonding experience of shared, rule-breaking play. We no longer believe that crowning a fool will ensure a good harvest or deflect a plague. Yet, we instinctively understand that periodically allowing a controlled, symbolic break from routine is healthy. It builds team cohesion, releases workplace tensions, and reminds everyone that the structures we live within are human creations, not unchangeable laws of nature. The modern versions are rituals of connection, not of catharsis driven by fear. This transformation shows how societies cling to symbolic shapes long after their original, life-or-death significance has evaporated. The skeleton of the ritual remains because it addresses a perennial human itch, the desire to momentarily step outside our assigned roles, to taste a different kind of power, and to see the world from the other side of the throne. We have demystified the magic but kept the party. The laughter that now accompanies these crowns is genuine, not the nervous release of a community appeasing the gods, but the joyful sound of people playing with the very idea of order itself. It proves that even in our sanitized modern world, we still feel the ancient pull to tell a story where, just for a day, the fool becomes the king. The stories we have followed rest on a fragile foundation of scattered clues. Our understanding of these fleeting kings and their single-day reigns is not drawn from a single, clear record, but painstakingly assembled from a mosaic of fragments, each piece offering a different, often biased perspective. Roman poets like Horace and give us vivid, personal glimpses of Saturnalia, writing with the wry humor of participants who enjoyed the festival's wine and mischief. Their verses capture the laughter and the social inversion, but they are the observations of the literate elite, not the slaves who wore the felt crown. From ancient Babylon, the evidence shifts in tone entirely. Here, we rely on meticulous cuneiform tablets, the administrative records of priestly astrologers. These are not poems, but clinical protocols, detailing the precise steps to take when an omen predicted disaster for the king. They speak of substitute rituals with the dry logic of a state manual, outlining a procedure to preserve power, not a celebration for the people. Centuries later, in medieval Europe, the evidence comes from an opposite angle, from those trying to suppress the tradition. Official church decrees and stern sermons repeatedly condemned the Feast of Fools, their very outrage preserving a detailed catalog of the unruly behavior they sought to ban, from dancing in the sanctuary to the election of boy bishops. These sources, while hostile, accidentally grant us a window into the ritual's enduring power, showing how it stubbornly persisted within the church itself. Then there are the accounts from outsiders. Spanish friars and soldiers, arriving in the Aztec world, witnessed ceremonies like, and documented them with a mixture of horror and fascination. Their chronicles are invaluable, yet they are filtered through the lens of conquest and a vastly different worldview, often interpreting what they saw as pure idolatry, missing the complex cosmological meanings understood by the participants. This patchwork of sources, each with its own agenda and blind spots, presents a profound challenge. The voices of the mock kings themselves, the slaves, the prisoners, the chosen ones, are almost entirely absent. Their experience is always mediated, seen through the eyes of the poet, the priest, the critic, or the conqueror. This forces historians to become detectives, reading between the lines, cross-referencing a satirical poem with a legal decree, or matching a friar's description to the archaeological footprint of a temple. Archaeology itself rarely captures something as ephemeral as a day-long performance. You cannot dig up laughter or the momentary weight of a paper crown. Yet material evidence can provide crucial support. A broken figurine of a man in a ridiculous costume found in a Roman household trash pit gives physical form to the literary descriptions. The specific layout of a temple pyramid, with its processional stairway, gives visceral reality to the chronicler's account of a final, solemn ascent. The very incompleteness of the record is its own kind of mystery. It invites a haunting question: how many other variations of this ritual, in how many other cultures, have been utterly lost to time? What stories of temporary queens, or different forms of symbolic sacrifice, faded away without a single poet or priest to jot them down? The fragments we have are perhaps just the most durable echoes of a once vast chorus of human attempts to bargain with chaos, a chorus where most of the voices are now, and forever, silent. From our modern vantage point, the sacrificial conclusion to these rituals is almost impossible to comprehend. It strikes us as a profound and chilling violation, the ultimate reduction of a human being to a mere instrument. We see a person stripped of consent, their agency erased, their life treated as expendable currency to purchase the psychological comfort or cosmic security of the group. Our ethical framework, built upon concepts of individual rights and the inherent dignity of every person, recoils at the idea that a community could so calmly designate one of its own for such a fate. We are left asking a haunting question: how could any society believe that stability was a price worth paying with a single, unwilling life? This tension forces us to confront a fundamental divide in how human value has been measured across time, the ancient calculus of the one versus the many. Yet, here lies the trap of historical judgment. To simply label these practices as barbaric or evil from our 21st century perch is to commit a subtle but significant fallacy. We are applying our moral operating system to a world that ran on completely different software. For the Babylonian priest overseeing the substitute king ritual, or the Aztec elder participating in, these were not acts of cruelty. They were acts of profound, solemn necessity, deeply embedded within a coherent and sacred worldview. In that cosmology, the individual and the community were not separate entities in competition. They were woven together in an unbreakable cosmic fabric. The sacrifice of the one was not a negation of that person's value, but the ultimate affirmation of their role within the interconnected whole. Their journey was seen as a sacred duty, a transaction that maintained the balance of the entire universe, ensuring the sun would rise, the rains would fall, and the community would endure. To refuse the ritual would have been, in their eyes, the truly immoral act, a selfish choice that would condemn everyone to disaster. This perspective does not ask us to agree with it, but to understand its internal logic. It challenges us to see that our modern concept of the autonomous, rights-bearing individual is a specific cultural invention, not a universal truth. In many ancient societies, identity was deeply collective, and personal fulfillment was found in fulfilling one's destined role for the health of the tribe, the city, or the cosmos. The mock king, in his most solemn form, was fulfilling the highest possible role his culture could imagine, becoming the linchpin that held reality itself together. This uncomfortable reflection ultimately turns the mirror back on us. While we have largely abandoned such literal rituals, do we not still engage in symbolic sacrifices for the perceived good of the collective? We might think of the soldier sent into conflict for national security, the ostracized for exposing institutional failure, or the scapegoated public figure who absorbs a society's anger during a crisis. We have medical triage, economic policies with calculated trade-offs, and political systems where individual interests are often subsumed for majority rule. The ancient ritual presents the mechanism in its starkest, most theatrical form, but the underlying tension between individual and group never truly vanished. It merely changed its costume and its language. Examining these distant ceremonies, therefore, is not an exercise in condemning the past, but an invitation to scrutinize the present. It asks us to consider where, in our own complex social machinery, we might still be designating temporary kings, loading them with our collective fears or hopes, and what fate, symbolic or otherwise, awaits them when their designated time is up. The real lesson may not be about how far we have come, but about how deeply the old patterns are still etched into the foundations of how we live together. The crown's greatest trick was to make its own power seem inevitable. By placing a fool on the throne for a day, the ritual performed a political theater, one that did not undermine the king but rather enshrined him. The chaotic, laughable reign of the temporary monarch served as the perfect foil. It created a stark, living contrast between two types of authority, the absurd pretender and the legitimate sovereign. The peasant king was impulsive, his commands were silly, and his entire reign was a fleeting joke. His very existence on the throne proved how easily the sacred office could be profaned, how quickly order could descend into farce when the wrong person held the scepter. This spectacle, witnessed by the entire community, made the return of the true king feel like a restoration of sanity. His rule, by comparison, appeared solemn, permanent, and divinely ordained, not a matter of chance or festival luck, but the natural state of the world. The ritual effectively staged a public service announcement for hereditary monarchy, dramatizing the terrifying alternative to remind everyone why the system was necessary. It transformed abstract political theory into a visceral, emotional experience. After laughing at the bumbling mock king, who would seriously want him to stay, the people's relief when the game ended was a silent vote of confidence for the established order. In this way, the Festival of Reversal became a powerful tool for legitimization. It the true king's authority by showing that not just anyone could do his job, that his bloodline and sacred right were what stood between society and a carnival of chaos. The palace walls, once breached by a peasant for a day, were rebuilt stronger in the imagination of the people, who now understood them not as barriers to freedom, but as the only bulwark against a world permanently turned upside down. Yet this spectacle of a temporary ruler finds its starkest contrast in a doctrine that sought to make kingship permanent and untouchable. Centuries after the last Saturnalia, a powerful political theory rose to dominance across Europe, known as the divine right of kings. Its core belief was absolute and simple. A monarch was not merely a political leader chosen by men, but God's own anointed representative on earth. His authority flowed directly from the divine, making his rule sacred, irrevocable, and beyond any earthly challenge. To rebel against the king was not just treason, it was a sin against God himself. This created a figure who was the complete opposite of the peasant king in every conceivable way. Where the mock monarch was mortal and expendable, the divine right king was seen as immortal in his office. Where the substitute was profane and laughable, the true sovereign was sacred and awe-inspiring. Where the temporary king's reign was measured in hours, the divine right monarch's reign was ordained for a lifetime. On the surface, these two ideas could not be more different. One celebrates the king's, the other his permanence. But look deeper, and you see they are two sides of the same ancient coin, both desperate attempts to solve the same human problem. How do you anchor the terrifying, chaotic power of politics in something stable, something beyond the whims of men? One ritual answered this by creating a disposable symbol to absorb instability. The other doctrine answered it by declaring the king himself to be that stable, unshakable symbol, fused with the divine. The temporary king, in his very fragility, made a silent argument for the real king's strength. By watching a fool be crowned and then uncrowned, the populace witnessed the chaos of a world without a legitimate, permanent sovereign. The ritual's conclusion, whether a return to servitude or a more solemn end, was a public rehearsal of what happened when sacred order broke down. This theatrical failure made the resumption of normal, divinely sanctioned kingship feel like a return to safety and cosmic harmony. In this way, the mock king's brief, chaotic reign actually reinforced the mystique and necessity of the divine right monarch. It was the shadow that made the light seem brighter. Both concepts, the sacrificial substitute and the immortal sovereign, sought to lift the office of kingship off the messy battlefield of human politics and place it on a supernatural plane. One used the drama of a scapegoat to purify the throne, the other declared the throne itself to be already pure and eternal. They represent two powerful strategies in the timeless human project of building legitimacy, of convincing people that the power structures they live under are not arbitrary, but are woven into the very fabric of the universe itself. One strategy used a story of ritual cleansing, the other a story of divine appointment. Yet their goal was identical: to make the authority of the state feel inevitable, natural, and beyond question. This reveals a profound truth about how societies manage the fear of chaos. They will often use opposing symbols, even contradictory stories, if those stories ultimately point toward the same conclusion, that order must be preserved at all costs. The table groaned under a weight it was never meant to bear. For the mock king, the lavish feast placed before him was the very heart of the performance. This was not a simple meal. It was a dense, symbolic language spoken in roast meats, honeyed wines, and delicate pastries. Every bite he took was a transgression, a physical consumption of a social boundary. These were the foods of the elite, reserved for palates accustomed to power and privilege. By eating them, the peasant or slave was doing more than filling his stomach. He was embodying the inverted world. He was taking the luxury that defined his superiors and internalizing it, making the abstract idea of role reversal a tangible, visceral reality. The rich flavors on his tongue, the unfamiliar textures, the feeling of fullness from a banquet rather than a ration, all of these sensations reinforced the impossible truth of his temporary crown. The feast made the fantasy feel real, not just for him, but for everyone watching. His consumption was a public spectacle, a living proof that the rules had truly been suspended. In more solemn rituals, where the temporary monarch's journey had a predetermined end, this final banquet took on an even heavier significance. Scholars have interpreted it through two powerful, intertwined lenses. One view sees it as a form of ceremonial preparation, a fattening of the sacred vessel. Just as a prized animal might be fed well before a significant offering, the individual was brought to a peak of physical vitality and richness, making them a more potent or acceptable sacrifice in the symbolic economy of the community. The other lens views it as a profound act of communion. By sharing this magnificent final meal with the one chosen, the community was not just feeding him, they were bonding with him. They were acknowledging his sacred role and, in a sense, partaking in the destiny he was about to fulfill for them all. It was a last supper of solidarity, where the line between honor and doom became beautifully, tragically blurred. But the feast's power extended far beyond the man at the head of the table. This was a shared transgression. When the community gathered to eat and drink during the festival, often enjoying better rations than usual themselves, they were not mere spectators. They were active participants in the temporary overthrow of the normal order. By indulging in the same elevated foods, by toasting the mock king with wine, they were all breaking dietary and social laws together. This collective act of sanctioned gluttony created a powerful bond of complicity. Everyone present became an accomplice in the ritual overthrow, making the restoration of order that followed feel like a collective, agreed-upon return rather than an imposed ending. Then, as suddenly as it began, the feasting would stop. The tables were cleared, the last cups were drained, and the ordinary rhythms of life resumed. This cessation was as symbolic as the banquet itself. The return to common bread, simple porridge, and standard rations marked the definitive end of ritual time. The world was no longer upside down, the stomach was no longer a site of rebellion, and the familiar hierarchy of hunger and satisfaction was firmly back in place. The full belly became an empty memory, a fleeting dream of a different world, making the reality of the everyday seem both harsher and more inevitable. The feast, therefore, was the engine of the ritual's emotional arc. It provided the fuel for the exhilarating climb into inversion, and made the return to earth feel like a natural and necessary descent. The air itself was a character in these ancient dramas, vibrating with a carefully orchestrated soundtrack of chaos and control. Saturnalia was not a quiet affair. It was a deafening celebration where the normal sounds of the city were drowned out by a roar of laughter, the clatter of dice, and the constant, joyful shout of "I O Saturnalia" ringing through the streets. This was not polite background music. It was the sound of order being dismantled, a boisterous symphony of misrule where every shout and song declared the world was upside down. In the medieval Feast of Fools, the soundtrack shifted to one of deliberate discord. Inside the cathedral, the solemn chants might be replaced by raucous, off-key singing, or sacred hymns rewritten with comic, even-body lyrics. The sound itself became a parody of holiness, a sonic inversion that made the laughter even louder and the temporary sacrilege feel complete. This noise was not an accident. It was the essential audio signature of the ritual's central phase, the period of licensed chaos. It marked a sacred time apart from everyday life, where the usual rules of quiet reverence or social decorum were not just broken, but joyously shattered. In stark, chilling contrast, other rituals use sound to build a bridge toward a solemn conclusion. Recall the final moments of the Aztec God Impersonator in. As he ascended the temple steps, he carried the flutes he had mastered during his year of divine life. His final act before the climactic ceremony was to smash these instruments, one by one, against the stone. The sharp crack of each breaking flute was a sound of profound finality, the audible end of his mortal performance as the deity. It was a signal that the music of his reign was over, and the silent, sacred part of the ritual was about to begin. In the Babylonian substitute king ceremony, we can imagine a different auditory landscape, the low murmur of priestly chants, the hushed tones of a court holding its breath, perhaps a terrible silence in the moments before the decoy was led away. Here, sound was not an expression of release, but a tool to cultivate dread, focus attention, and mark the transition from profane play to deadly serious spiritual business. This manipulation of sound reveals a sophisticated understanding of human psychology. The raucous noise of the carnival created a collective emotional high, a shared fever pitch that made participants feel united in rebellion. It was an acoustic blanket that smothered individual doubt and wrapped everyone in the exhilarating feeling of the moment. Conversely, the shift to silence or solemn chant served as a powerful emotional reset. It drained the energy of the crowd, focused their minds, and prepared them for the ritual's weighty conclusion or its simple end. The control of the auditory environment was a direct method of steering the communal heart. By dictating what was heard, the keepers of the ritual could orchestrate how people felt, guiding them from laughter to awe, from rebellion to acceptance. The final return to everyday sounds, the normal chatter of the market, the routine calls of street vendors, or the familiar bells of the church tolling for ordinary prayer, was the ultimate signal that the extraordinary time was over. The world had not only been set right side up again, it had been returned to its normal volume, a clear, unmistakable sign that the temporary king's reign and all the chaotic potential it represented was finally, definitively at an end. The ancient stage for these rituals may have vanished, but the story they told never left us. It simply found a new home in the pages of books and the glow of our screens, where the king for a day trope continues to haunt and captivate. Modern storytellers, perhaps without even realizing it, are still wrestling with the same profound questions those festivals sought to answer. Take Jackson's terrifying short story, The Lottery. On a sunny summer day, a small town gathers for an annual tradition. There is a sense of community, of normalcy, as families chat and children play. Then a name is drawn from a box. The winner, Hutchinson, is not given a crown or a feast. Her reward is to be stoned to death by her neighbors, including her own family. Jackson strips the ancient ritual of its historical costume, presenting it in a plain, modern setting. The effect is chilling because the mechanics are identical: a communal selection, a designated bearer of misfortune, and a violent conclusion performed for the perceived good of the whole. The story asks us directly, what ancient, unthinking rituals do we still perform, cloaked in the garb of tradition? It is a literary echo of the most solemn sacrificial kings, a reminder that the scapegoat mechanism is not buried in the past, but a persistent shadow in the human psyche. The pattern evolves further in The Hunger Games. Here, the selection is televised. The tributes from each district are not slaves or prisoners in the old sense, but they are equally expendable in the eyes of the capital. Before the arena, they are paraded in finery, celebrated in interviews, and treated as celebrities. This is their fleeting, gilded hour as mock royalty, lavished with attention and luxury they never knew. It is a cruel, modern satire of the Babylonian decoy feast, a period of elevation that only makes the impending conclusion more devastating. The spectacle serves the same ultimate purpose for the ruling power. It is a tool of social control, a demonstration of absolute authority that channels the district's despair into a grim, mandatory pageant. Even in lighter stories, the archetype provides a powerful engine for transformation. The animated film The Emperor's New Groove turns the concept into a comedy of errors. The spoiled, arrogant emperor is magically transformed into a peasant, a llama, and forced to see the world from the bottom. While played for laughs, his journey is a classic inversion, a ruler stripped of his status and made to understand the lives of those he disregarded. His path back to the throne requires him to earn a new kind of legitimacy, not through divine right, but through empathy and friendship. It is a gentler, redemptive take on the ritual, where the temporary loss of status becomes a lesson rather than a sentence. These diverse modern reflections prove the pattern's incredible durability. They show we are still mesmerized by stories that explore the thin line between honor and sacrifice, between celebration and condemnation. We are still critiquing the ways societies designate outsiders, manage collective fear, and perform rituals that maintain control. The peasant king may no longer walk our streets, but he lives on in our fiction, a timeless symbol asking us who we choose to crown, and for what purpose in the stories we tell about ourselves. Even with all these fragments pieced together, the map remains full of blank spaces. Our understanding of these rituals is built on islands of evidence in a vast sea of silence, and the mysteries left unanswered are as compelling as the stories we can tell. Consider the sprawling ancient civilizations of India and China, with their complex social hierarchies and rich ceremonial traditions. Did they too have festivals where a beggar was dressed as an emperor, or a criminal was treated as a sage for a single fateful day? Historians have found hints and parallels, suggestions of symbolic reversals in seasonal celebrations, but no clear, documented equivalent to the Babylonian or the Roman Saturnalia has yet emerged from their records. This silence is haunting. It forces us to wonder if such rituals were once universal, a shared human grammar for managing power and fear, but the specific scripts from these cultures have been lost to time, eroded away, or deliberately erased by later dynasties that found such practices embarrassing or impious. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is an open door for speculation. How many other versions of this story were performed under different skies, for different gods, and are now utterly forgotten? The gaps in our knowledge extend even to the rituals we know by name. Take the Babylonian. We understand its grim purpose, but the exact mechanics of selection remain fuzzy. Was the substitute king chosen by a random lottery, a roll of the dice that echoed the whims of fate? Or was he selected through meticulous priestly divination, the examination of a sheep's liver or the flight of birds pointing to one specific, doomed individual? Perhaps there was a designated pool of candidates, prisoners of war or slaves already marked for some other end, whose final service was to serve as this royal decoy. We simply do not know. The cuneiform tablets give us the why, but rarely the intimate how. This missing detail matters because it obscures the final moments of personal agency, or lack thereof, for the man at the center. Was there a moment of choice, however grim, or was it a sentence passed without appeal? Similarly, while Roman poets paint a vivid picture of the Saturnalia's chaos, they gloss over the morning after. What was the precise ceremonial process of returning the slave king to his master? Was there a formal moment where the felt crown was removed, a spoken phrase that marked the transition back to reality? Or did it simply fade, the laughter dying down, the colorful robes put away, leaving the slave to wake the next day to a world that had snapped back to normal as if by magic? The emotional texture of that return is lost to us. Did the master clap the slave on the back with a knowing smile? Or was there a stiff, awkward silence as both parties pretended the inversion had never happened? The psychological aftermath for the temporary monarch is a historical silence we cannot fill. And what of the families? This is perhaps the most profound silence in the entire record. We hear of the crowd's laughter and the priest's chants, but we never hear from the wife of the condemned man chosen in Babylon, or the children of the slave who played prince in Rome? What did they feel as their loved one was dressed in borrowed glory? Was it a time of dread, of confused pride, or of sheer terror? Their perspectives, the domestic echo of these grand public spectacles, are almost entirely absent. They are the unheard chorus in this strange opera, their private grief or anxiety swallowed by the historical focus on the ritual's public function. These persistent gaps are not failures of research. They are the very nature of history itself. They remind us that the past is not a clear window, but a reconstruction from scattered shards. The full human experience of these bizarre ceremonies, in all its terror, fleeting joy, and profound complexity, may forever remain just beyond our grasp. We can analyze the structure and theorize about the psychology, but the heartbeat of the moment, the individual pulse of fear or elation beneath the costume, is gone. And so these mysteries endure, not as frustrating dead ends, but as invitations. They invite endless speculation, careful scholarship, and the humility to acknowledge that some chapters of the human story are written in ink that has permanently faded, leaving us to ponder the empty spaces where real people once lived, loved, and played their part in a ritual they could not fully understand. These rituals were not primitive superstitions, but a kind of ancient social technology. They were humanity's early, instinctive attempts to engineer stability, using narrative and symbol as their primary tools. By creating a designated figure to embody chaos, societies could perform a controlled experiment with disorder, observing its effects within the safe confines of ritual time. The peasant king was a living circuit breaker, deliberately tripped to prevent a total systemic overload. Whether his day ended in laughter or in solemn ceremony, the result was the same, a reset. The community's shared anxieties about scarcity, injustice, or divine anger were funneled into a single manageable story with a clear beginning and end. This provided a profound psychological service, transforming amorphous, terrifying fears into a structured drama that people could witness, participate in, and ultimately survive. In doing so, these rituals performed a delicate magic. They made the fragile structures of power and tradition feel as immutable as the seasons. They connected the human-made world of kings and slaves to the vast, impersonal cycles of the cosmos, suggesting that social order was not a mere convenience, but a reflection of a deeper, natural law. The temporary king was the hinge between those two worlds, the human element sacrificed, either symbolically or literally, to keep the greater machinery turning. So what does this ancient impulse tell us about ourselves? The need to periodically invert our world, to crown a fool, to chase out winter, or to load our troubles onto a scapegoat, points to a fundamental tension in the human condition. We are creatures who build intricate structures of rules and roles, yet we chafe against their constraints. We crave the safety of order, but we are fascinated by the thrill of chaos. These rituals were a brilliant, pre-scientific solution to that paradox. They allowed societies to have it both ways, to taste rebellion without revolution, to touch the sacred without being consumed by it, and to acknowledge the individual's suffering as the price for the collective's peace. While we no longer believe a substitute king can alter the fate of crops or appease an angry god, the underlying patterns are still woven into the fabric of our modern lives. We see it in the way we celebrate, crowning homecoming royalty or a festival king. We see it in our stories, from the sacrificial tributes of dystopian fiction to the comedic Bosphoridae office prank. We even see it in the fleeting, often brutal cycles of celebrity culture, where individuals are elevated to near-royal status only to be torn down, serving as modern, media-driven scapegoats for broader societal frustrations. These are our gentler, often unconscious, echoes of Saturnalia, and they remind us that the human need for catharsis, for a shared story that binds a community and defines its boundaries, is timeless. The next time you put on a costume for a holiday, laugh at a satirical skit about a leader, or even participate in a tradition whose origins you have forgotten, pause for a moment. You might just be participating in the latest, softened chapter of a very old story, one where for a single, sanctioned moment, the world turns upside down, so that tomorrow it can right itself again. If exploring these deep currents of history and human behavior intrigues you, consider subscribing for more journeys into the past's most compelling mysteries. And we would love to hear your perspective. What modern rituals or traditions do you see as the inheritors of this ancient, paradoxical crown? Share your thoughts in the comments below.